Widow inherits an abandoned farmstead, and understood why everyone was afraid. Margaret Wilson trembled as she held the rusty keys the lawyer had placed in her hands 3 days earlier. At 62, a widow for 4 years, she never imagined she would receive an inheritance from someone she had never met in person. When the bus stopped in the village of Pine Ridge, in rural Colorado, and she stepped off with her single suitcase, she noticed something strange. The people in the main square stopped talking. They looked at her with a mix of curiosity and something that seemed like pity. "Are you the new owner of the Thompson house?" asked an elderly man with white hair selling fruit from a makeshift stall. "I'm Margaret. I inherited a property here from an aunt named Helen Thompson." The man immediately lowered his gaze. "May God protect you," he murmured, making the sign of the cross. Margaret felt a shiver run down her spine. That wasn't the only odd reaction. When she asked about a room at the village's only boarding house, the owner, a plump woman in her 50s, visibly hesitated. "Are you really going to stay in that house?" she asked, her eyes wide. "I need to at least see what I inherited. The lawyer said it's 6 hectares of land." "Good land, that's true, but that house—" The woman didn't finish her sentence. She just shook her head and handed over the key to a simple room on the 2nd floor of the boarding house. That night, Margaret barely slept. From the hallway she heard whispers. She recognized the voice of the boarding house owner talking to someone. Poor thing. She doesn't know what she's going to find. "No one has been there in over 20 years, Betty. The house must be falling apart. It's not the house that worries me. It's what happened there." Margaret got out of bed and pressed her ear to the door, but the voices faded down the hallway. She lay back down, restless. What had happened in that house? Why did everyone react with such fear when she mentioned the inheritance? The next morning, she decided to go to the property. Betty, the boarding house owner, offered to ask her nephew to take her in his pickup truck, but when the young man learned the destination, he made up some excuse about needing to help with the harvest. "I can walk," said Margaret, trying to hide her frustration. "The lawyer said it's 3 kilometers from here." "At the end of the dirt road, after you pass the old bridge over the creek," Betty explained reluctantly. "But, Mom, be careful. That area—" Again, the sentence hung in the air, unfinished. Margaret started walking along the dusty road. The October sun beat down hard on her head, covered by a cotton scarf. The scenery was beautiful, full of banana trees and dense vegetation. In the distance, she could see the mist-covered mountains. She crossed the wooden bridge, which creaked under her feet, and continued along the increasingly narrow road. That's when she saw the 2 dogs. They appeared out of nowhere, one with golden fur and the other white, both medium-sized. They didn't bark, just watched her with attentive eyes. Margaret stopped, afraid they might attack her, but the animals simply started walking in front of her, as if guiding her. "Do you know the way?" she asked aloud, feeling foolish for talking to dogs. A few more meters ahead, the house emerged among the trees. Margaret stopped, observing. It was an old, dark wood building with a tiled roof that seemed ready to collapse. The windows had broken glass, and the front door was ajar, swaying slightly in the wind. The 2 dogs sat beside her, quiet. It was then that Margaret noticed something disturbing. Around the property, on the barbed wire fence marking the boundary, small objects were hanging. She approached cautiously. They were cloth dolls, dozens of them, some already deteriorated by time and weather, swaying in the wind. Margaret Wilson's heart raced. What kind of place was this? She took a deep breath, gathering courage, and walked toward the house. The porch steps creaked under her feet. She put the key into the rusty lock, but the door was already open. She pushed it carefully. The smell of mold and neglect filled her nostrils. The living room was covered in dust, with old furniture hidden under dirty sheets. There were spider webs in every corner. Margaret took a few steps inside, and the dogs followed her, as if they had every right to be there. "Do you live here?" she asked the animals, who calmly lay down on a worn-out rug. She began exploring the rooms. A kitchen with a wood-burning stove, a solid wood table, dishes and pots still on the shelves. Everything covered by years of neglect. She went up the creaking stairs to the 2nd floor, where she found 3 bedrooms. In the first bedroom, the bed was still made, as if someone were coming back any moment. In the second, there was a bookshelf filled with old books and some clothes hanging in a closet. It was in the third bedroom that Margaret found something that made her tremble. The walls were covered in drawings, not childish scribbles, but detailed drawings made with charcoal and crayons. Women's faces, clasped hands, broken hearts, huge tears running down sad faces. And in the center of the main wall, a phrase written in large, shaky letters, "We don't want to be forgotten." Margaret felt her legs weaken. She sat on the edge of the dusty bed, trying to process what she saw. Who had written that? Who were these people who didn't want to be forgotten? She ran her hands over her face, feeling the weight of all those years of abandonment. The house wasn't just old. It was a place filled with sadness, with untold stories, with lives somehow cut short. She went down the stairs again and decided to explore the grounds around the house. Behind the main building, she found a small vegetable garden completely overgrown with weeds, but she could still see some herb plants bravely holding on. Basil, rosemary, mint. Someone had cared for them lovingly once. Further on, she discovered a smaller building that seemed to have been a chicken coop, and then something caught her attention, an area of the ground that looked like it had been disturbed recently. The soil was turned over, different from the rest covered by vegetation. Margaret was about to investigate when she heard a voice behind her. "You shouldn't be here." She turned quickly. A man about 60 years old, thin, wearing farm worker's clothes, watched her with a serious expression. He held a machete, but not in a threatening way. "This property is mine," Margaret replied, trying to sound firm despite her fright. "I inherited it from Helen Thompson." "I know that. The whole village already knows. But that doesn't change the fact that this isn't a place for you to be poking around alone." "And why? What's so terrible here that everyone's even afraid to talk about it?" The man looked at the house, then back at her. "My name is Walter. I live over there on the next property, about 500 meters away. I've been taking care of these lands since they've been empty." "For how long?" 23 years. "And what happened 23 years ago?" Walter hesitated. His eyes scanned the house again as if reliving some painful memory. "You really don't know anything?" "Nothing. I never met my Aunt Helen. I didn't even know she existed until the lawyer contacted me." "Helen was a good woman, different from the rest of the Thompson family. She tried to help when she could." "Help who?" "The girls." Margaret felt a lump in her throat. "What girls?" Walter walked to the porch and sat on the worn steps. Margaret followed him, sitting beside him. The two dogs appeared and lay at his feet as if they knew him well. "Are these dogs yours?" Margaret asked. "In a way. They're descendants of the ones who lived here. When the last people left, the animals stayed. They kept living on the property, having babies. I bring them food sometimes." "And the girls?" insisted Margaret. Walter took a deep breath. This house belonged to the Thompson family. The father, Robert Thompson, was a respected man in the village, rich, a landowner. He married Martha, a beautiful but very quiet woman. They had 3 daughters. Margaret waited for him to continue. "The girls were different," said Walter, choosing his words carefully. "The oldest, Rose, had trouble speaking. The middle one, Lydia, was born deaf. The youngest, Beatrice, had trouble learning things, you know. She needed more time, more patience. And back then, in the 70s, 80s, families like the Thompsons were ashamed of these things. Robert didn't want anyone to know that his daughters were special, so he hid them. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now continuing." Margaret's stomach churned. "What do you mean hid?" "Literally. He kept the 3 girls here, in this house, away from everything and everyone. They didn't go to school, didn't go out to play, didn't have friends. Their mother took care of them, but she was practically a prisoner too. Robert didn't let anyone visit the house." That's awful." "It was. The worst part is that the whole village knew. Everyone saw that there were 3 girls living there, but no one did anything. It was as if it were normal, you know. People would whisper about it, but no one tried to help." "And your Aunt Helen?" "Helen was Martha's cousin, the girl's mother. She was the only person Robert allowed to visit the house because he knew Helen wouldn't spread it to everyone. But she did try. She tried to convince Robert to let the girls have a better life, to take them to doctors, to special schools. He never agreed. Margaret felt growing nausea. What happened to them? Walter looked at his own hands. Robert passed away when I was about 20. Heart attack. Martha tried to keep taking care of the girls alone, but she wasn't in good health either. Helen started coming more often, bringing food, clothes. She was the one who taught the girls how to make those dolls you saw on the fence. Why did they make dolls? It was the only way they had to express what they felt. Each doll had a name, a story. They embroidered the names, made little clothes. It was as if they had invisible friends, you know. And then? Martha became seriously ill. She had to be taken to the big city hospital. The girls were left alone here for a few days, with Helen coming to take care of them. That's when it happened. Margaret held her breath. When what happened? The people in the village started getting scared. They said they heard strange noises coming from the house at night, lights turning on and off. Some people swore they saw shadows in the windows. They started spreading that the house was haunted, that the girls had strange powers. But they were just scared and lonely girls. Exactly. But the fear spread. Groups of people even came here, shouting for them to leave, saying they were going to burn the house down. Helen managed to stop it, but the damage was done. The girls became even more terrified, more isolated. And what happened to them in the end? Walter was silent for a long moment. That I can't say. One day, they simply weren't here anymore. Helen showed up, packed their things, and took the three away. No one asked where. No one wanted to know. The whole village was relieved not to have to deal with that situation anymore. And Martha? She passed away in the hospital shortly after. Helen came back only once to close up the house. She said she would never come back, that this place held too much sadness, and she truly never returned. I heard she moved to another city, far from here. But she left the house to me. Why? I don't know, ma'am. Perhaps because there was no one else. Or maybe because she wanted someone to give this place a new meaning. Margaret looked at the dark wooden house, at the dolls hanging on the fence, at the drawings on the bedroom walls. Are people still afraid because they think the house is haunted? It's not exactly fear of ghosts. It's fear of their own shame. Everyone here knows they could have done something for those girls and didn't. It's easier to avoid the place than to face the guilt. And the girls? Are they okay? Where are they? Walter stood up, dusting off his pants. That I really don't know. Helen never told anyone, but I hope they're in a better place than this. He started to walk away, but Margaret called him. Walter, thank you for telling me the truth. Are you going to stay? Will you live here? Margaret looked at the house again. Despite all the sadness those walls carried, she felt something ignite within her. A desire to do things differently, to transform that place. I don't know yet, but I won't just sell and forget. This story deserves to be known. Walter nodded and left. Margaret remained there, sitting on the steps, with the two dogs by her side, thinking about everything she had just discovered. She returned to the boarding house at dusk, exhausted and emotionally drained. Betty welcomed her with hot tea and cheese bread, but asked no questions. Margaret silently appreciated the discretion. That night, lying in the narrow bed of the boarding house room, Margaret thought of the three girls, Rose, Lydia, and Beatrice. 3 lives stolen by prejudice and shame. 3 stories no one wanted to hear. She remembered her own children. She had 2, a son and a daughter, both grown and living far away. When her husband passed away 4 years ago, they suggested she move in with one of them. But Margaret refused. She wanted to keep her independence, her own life. Was she being selfish in thinking about staying in that house? Her children would certainly think it madness. But there was something in that story that touched her deeply. Perhaps because she herself knew the feeling of being invisible, of being forgotten. After she became a widow, many people simply stopped reaching out to her. It was as if she had ceased to exist as an individual and had become just Anthony's widow. At family gatherings, she sat in the corner, listening to conversations she didn't take part in. At church meetings, she was greeted with polite but empty smiles. That unexpected inheritance had arrived as a possibility for a fresh start, and now, knowing the story of the house, she felt she had a greater purpose. The next morning, Margaret sought out the village priest. She found Father Michael in the sacristy of the small church, organizing the vestments. "Good morning, Father. May I speak with you?" The priest, a man with greying hair and about 65 years old, looked at her kindly. "Of course, my child. Have a seat." They sat in the front pew. Margaret told him about the inheritance and what she had discovered about the Thompson house. The priest listened in silence, his expression growing increasingly serious. "I was too young when all this happened," he said finally. "I hadn't even been ordained yet, but I know the story. It was one of the greatest shames of this community. Do you know where the girls are now?" Father Michael hesitated. "I know about one of them. Beatrice, the youngest. She is alive." Margaret's heart raced. "Where?" "In a nursing home about 150 kilometers from here. St. Mary's Home of Mercy in the town of St. Sebastian Valley. Helen placed her there when she realized she could no longer care for her alone." "And the others?" "Rose passed away about 15 years ago. Helen managed to find a family that took her in, and she lived her final years with dignity. Lydia, I don't know. I lost contact. Is Beatrice well? How is she?" "Lucid, from what I know. She's 87 now, but her mind is sharp. It's her body that can't keep up anymore." Margaret felt a growing urgency. "I need to speak with her." "Why?" "Because she deserves to know that someone cares, that someone wants to hear her story." The priest smiled sadly. "I'll give you the address. But prepare yourself, my child. Beatrice carries a lot of pain, and a lot of anger too." Margaret spent the next 2 days planning the trip to St. Sebastian Valley. It would be a journey of several hours by bus, but she was determined. Before leaving, she went back to the house one last time. She wanted to clean it a little, make it look less frightening. She brought some cleaning supplies she bought at the small village market. While sweeping the living room, removing cobwebs and accumulated dust, she heard footsteps on the porch. It was a woman about 70 years old, short, with white hair tied in a bun. "Sorry to bother you," said the woman with a trembling voice. "I saw that you were here and I needed to speak with you." "Please, come in," invited Margaret. The woman entered slowly, looking around as if seeing ghosts. "It's been so long," she murmured. "This living room, I remember it full of light. Martha liked flowers. There were always flowers in the vases." "Did you know the family?" The woman sat in a chair that Margaret had cleaned. "My name is Grace. When I was a child, before Robert forbade visits, I was friends with Rose." Margaret sat down too, eager to listen. "What was she like?" "Rose was beautiful. She had long dark hair, big eyes. She had trouble speaking, but she understood everything. We used to play in the backyard with dolls playing house. She laughed a lot. She had a lovely laugh to hear." Grace's eyes filled with tears. "And then Robert started to change. I think it was when Beatrice was born, and he realized she was special too. He became obsessed with hiding his daughters. He forbade visits. When I tried to come see Rose, he would shoo me away. He yelled at me, at my mother. And you stopped trying? We stopped. And I hate myself for it to this day. Rose was my friend. She needed me. But I was a child, and my parents were afraid of Robert. He had influence, power. He could harm my father's business." Grace wiped her tears with the back of her hand. "I've carried this guilt my whole life." Seeing Rose through the window, knowing she was trapped in there suffering. "And I did nothing." "You were a child," said Margaret gently. "It wasn't your responsibility." "But when I grew up, I did nothing either. None of us did. We were all adults. We could have reported it, helped in some way. But it was easier to pretend it wasn't happening." Margaret held Grace's hand. "But you are here now. You are telling me the truth. That has value." Grace looked at her with hope in her eyes. "What are you going to do with this house?" "I don't know yet, but I want it to be something that honors the girls' memory, something that shows they mattered. If you need help, you can count on me. It's the least I can do." After Grace left, Margaret continued cleaning. She went up to the room with the drawings on the walls and stood there, observing every line, every word. There was so much feeling in those images, so much life wanting to get out. She took pictures of everything with the cell phone her daughter had given her for her last birthday. She wanted to record it, preserve that story. The next morning she left for St. Sebastian Valley. The bus ride was long and tiring, but Margaret was determined. She carried with her a bag with some of the dolls she had taken from the fence, carefully cleaned. She arrived at St. Mary's Home of Mercy in the middle of the afternoon. It was an old but well-kept building, with flower gardens at the entrance. The receptionist, a young woman in a white uniform, greeted her with a smile. "I'm here to visit Beatrice Thompson." The young woman's smile faded a little. "Are you a relative?" "Not exactly, but I inherited her family's property and would really like to speak with her." The receptionist hesitated. "Beatrice doesn't get many visitors. In fact, she hasn't had any in years. Please, it's very important." After a few minutes of waiting, the receptionist returned, accompanied by an older nurse. "Beatrice has agreed to see you, but I must warn you that she sometimes gets agitated. If that happens, I'll have to ask you to leave." "I understand." Margaret was led down a long hallway to a room on the ground floor. The door was slightly ajar. The nurse knocked lightly before entering. "Beatrice, your visitor is here." Margaret entered the room and felt her heart tighten. In the wheelchair near the window was a very elderly woman, very thin with completely white hair. Her eyes, however, were alive and attentive. "Who are you?" asked Beatrice in a hoarse but firm voice. "My name is Margaret Wilson. I inherited the house where you lived with your sisters." Beatrice's eyes narrowed. "Helen's house?" "That's right." "Is Helen gone?" "I'm sorry to say, but yes. She passed away a few months ago." Beatrice turned her face to the window, but not before Margaret saw the tears streaming down. "She was the only one who cared," said Beatrice, after a long silence. Margaret pulled up a chair and sat beside her. "I brought something I think is yours." She opened the bag and took out one of the dolls. Beatrice took the doll with trembling hands, looking at it closely. "Anne?" She read the name embroidered on the dress. "I made this doll when I was 12. There were many of them hanging on the fence around the house. Helen hung them. She said that way the dolls could see the world outside, since we couldn't." Beatrice clutched the doll to her chest. "Why did you come?" "Because I want to know the truth about what happened, and I want to do something with that house. Something that makes sense." "Truth?" Beatrice laughed, but it was a joyless laugh. "The truth is, we were buried alive in that house. My father was ashamed of us because we were different. Our mother loved us, but she didn't have the courage to stand up to him." "Tell me about your sisters." Beatrice's face softened a little. Rose was the oldest. She had trouble speaking, but she was the smartest of us three. Lydia was deaf, but she saw everything, understood people better than anyone. And I just needed more time to learn things, but my father thought I was stupid. "Did you create a way to communicate?" "Lydia taught us signs. Rose created drawings that meant things. I wrote down everything I could. We had a world all our own, you know, a world where no one could hurt us." "Were the dolls part of that world?" "They were our only friends. Each one had a personality, a story. Sometimes we would put on little plays with them. It was our way of imagining what life outside would be like." Margaret felt a lump in her throat. "And when your mother got sick?" "It was terrible. We were left alone. Helen came when she could, but she had her own life. She worked. The people from the village started shouting horrible things at us. They threw stones at the windows, said we were witches, that the house was cursed. You were scared?" "Very. One night a group of men came to the house saying they were going to force us out, that they were going to burn everything. Helen arrived in time and confronted them. She yelled at them, got everyone's attention. She was the only one who had the courage to stand up for us. And then she got us out of there. She managed to find places for us. Rose went to live with a family in another town, people who cared for special adults. Lydia went to a faraway place, very far away. Helen said it would be better this way. And you?" "I came here. I was 27 years old, but I hardly knew how to do anything on my own. I had never been to school, never worked. Here they taught me things, gave me a purpose. I worked in the kitchen for many years, then in the laundry. When I got too old to work, they let me stay. And your sisters? I saw Rose a few times before she left. She was happy for the first time in her life. She had friends, went out for walks. Lydia. I never saw Lydia again. Helen said she was fine but couldn't say where. I think she was afraid someone might go after her. Margaret held Beatrice's hand. I'm sorry for everything you went through. You don't need to be sorry. It wasn't your fault. It was the fault of an entire village that chose to look the other way. But I want to do things differently. I want this story to be known. I want people to know who you really were. Beatrice looked at her with a mix of surprise and distrust. Why? What do you gain from this? Nothing. But maybe it will keep others from going through the same thing you did. They talked for over 2 hours. Beatrice told stories from childhood about the games they invented, the dreams they had. She talked about how she learned to read by herself, looking at the old books her mother kept, how Lydia taught them to see the world through gestures and expressions, how Rose drew everything she felt because the words wouldn't come out right from her mouth. When the nurse came to say visiting hours were ending, Beatrice held Margaret's hand tightly. Will you come back? I will. I promise. And the house? What will you do with it? I don't know yet, but I promise it will be something that honors the three of you. Beatrice nodded with tears in her eyes. Helen used to say that one day someone would understand. I think that someone is you. Margaret returned to Pine Ridge with a heavy heart, but determined. The story of Beatrice, Rose, and Lydia needed to be told, but how? In the following days, she began cleaning the house more systematically. She hired a man from the village, very much against his will, to fix the roof and windows. Walter helped when he could, always silent but present. It was during the cleaning of the attic that Margaret made a discovery that would change everything. Inside an old wooden box, she found hundreds of letters. They were handwritten in different scripts, addressed to people in the outside world but never sent. She started reading, and tears streamed freely down her face. Dear teacher, my name is Rose Thompson, and I am 15 years old. I have never been to school, but I learned to read with Mum's books. I am writing this letter to you because I dream of studying. I wanted to learn about the world, about history, about math. My father says I don't need to, that I'll never leave here anyway. But what if I could? What if someone gave me a chance? Rose. Another letter from Lydia. To whoever reads, I can't hear, but I can see everything. I see people passing by on the road, laughing, talking. I wish so much I could be there with them. I wanted to have a real friend, not just a pretend one. Sometimes I dream that I am in a school, learning real sign language, not the one I made up with my sisters. Would anyone on the outside care about me? Lydia. And from Beatrice. Hi, my father thinks I'm dumb because I take time to understand things. But I do understand. I just need more time. Could the teacher in town teach me? I would be a good student, I promise. I would pay attention, do all the assignments. I just want a chance to show that I can learn. Beatrice. Margaret read letter after letter, each one a cry for help, disguised as a dream. Pleas that were never answered, voices that were never heard. At the bottom of the box, she found something even more disturbing, a thin notebook with a worn, hard cover. She opened it and recognized the handwriting. It was Helen's. I don't know what else to do. I've tried everything. I spoke with the priest, with the mayor, with anyone who might have influence over Robert. But nobody wants to get involved. They say it's family matters, that it's none of their business. The girls are fading away. Not physically, but inside. I see the light going out in their eyes every day. Rose stopped drawing. Lydia spends hours staring out the window without moving. Beatrice cries at night, trying to muffle the sound in her pillow. Martha is also getting worse. Her husband controls her completely. She told me, in secret, that she tried to run away with the girls twice. Both times he found them and punished her. He locked her in the room for days. How is it possible that this is happening and nobody does anything? How is it possible that an entire village pretends everything is fine? I need to find a solution. I need to save these girls before it's too late. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out, now continuing. Margaret closed the notebook, feeling a deep anger growing inside her. It wasn't just the story of the three sisters that revolted her. It was the complicit silence of an entire community. Determined, she scheduled a meeting with Father Michael and asked him to summon some important people from the village. She wanted to talk to all of them. The meeting took place on a Thursday afternoon in the parish hall of the church. Present were the priest, Walter, Grace, Betty from the boarding house, the current mayor, and some older residents who knew the story. Margaret began by showing photographs of the drawings on the walls, the dolls, the never-sent letters. She read excerpts from Helen's notebook. The silence in the room was deafening. "You all knew," said Margaret, with a firm voice. "Some of you saw it with your own eyes. Others heard the rumors and chose not to investigate. But everyone knew that 3 girls were suffering and nobody did anything." One of the older residents, a man of about 80 named Douglas, stood up. "It was different back then," he said defensively. "Things were handled differently." "Different?" Margaret stared at him. "Locking 3 children inside the house, preventing them from having an education, friends, a life that was never right. Not in any era." "Robert Thompson was a powerful man," continued Douglas. "Nobody had the courage to stand up to him." "Then you were all cowards," replied Margaret, without mincing words. Grace began to cry silently. Betty looked at her own hands, unable to face Margaret. Father Michael spoke up. "Margaret is right. This is a shame we carry as a community, and we need to take responsibility for it." "Why are you bringing all this up now?" asked the mayor, a middle-aged man who seemed uncomfortable. "Those people are gone. What's the use of reopening old wounds?" "Because Beatrice isn't gone," replied Margaret. "She's alive in a nursing home, 87 years old, and she deserves to know that her story matters." "What do you want from us?" asked Douglas. "I want help to turn that house into something meaningful. I want to create a place that honors the memory of Rose, Lydia, and Beatrice, and I want this village to take responsibility for what happened." "What kind of place?" asked the priest. Margaret took a deep breath. The idea had formed in her mind gradually, but now it was clear. "A support center for families with special needs children, a place where they can learn, develop skills, have friends, where families receive guidance and support, not judgment and shame." The mayor shook his head. "That will require money, professionals, infrastructure. We don't have the resources for that." "Then let's find them. But before anything else, I need you to acknowledge what was done. Publicly." The meeting dragged on for hours. There was resistance, denial, discomfort. But there were also people like Grace, who were ready to take the blame and do things differently. When everyone had left, Margaret was alone with Father Michael. "Do you think you can do it?" he asked. "I don't know. But I have to try. You have my support and my help with whatever you need." Margaret returned home late at night. Betty was waiting for her with a hot dinner. "I heard the meeting was tense," she commented, serving soup. "It was, but necessary." "You know, I knew too," Betty confessed, sitting at the table. "I didn't live here yet when they were children, but when I arrived about 25 years ago, I heard the stories, and when they were still in the house, alone, before Helen took them away, I saw them at the window with those frightened eyes, and I did nothing. Why? Fear. Fear of getting involved, of being rejected by the community. I was new here. I needed people to accept my business. It was pure selfishness. But now you can do things differently." "How?" "By helping me make this center a reality, helping to care for the people who come." Betty nodded, tears in her eyes. "I'll do whatever I can." In the following days, Margaret intensified her work on the house. She began making a detailed plan of what would be needed: a complete cleaning, structural repairs, furniture, educational materials, qualified professionals. That's when her son showed up. Richard arrived unannounced by car coming from the capital. He was 42, a successful doctor, married, with 2 teenage children. When he saw his mother in the old house, wearing simple clothes and covered in dust, he was shocked. "Mom, what is this place?" "It's my inheritance, Richard, the house I inherited. This place is falling apart. You can't stay here." "I'm not going to live here. I'm going to turn it into something useful." Richard looked around, visibly uncomfortable. "Turn it into what?" "Mom, you're 62. You should be resting, enjoying life, not getting involved in crazy projects." Margaret felt her anger rising. Crazy? "Richard, do you know the history of this place?" "I know enough. I know it has a bad reputation, that no one wants to come near it. Sell this land, take the money, and come back home." "This is my home now." "Don't be ridiculous. Your grandchildren miss you. Amanda keeps asking me when Grandma is going to visit them. And I do visit, but I'm not going to abandon this project." "What project? What are you talking about?" Margaret told her son everything. The story of the 3 sisters, the community's neglect, her plans for the support center. Richard listened with growing impatience. "Mom, that's not your responsibility. You didn't even know those people." "So what? Just because I didn't know them means I shouldn't care." "It means you shouldn't waste your time and money on this. Think rationally. Where will you get the resources? Who's going to run this so-called center? You have no experience in this." "I'll learn." "You're being stubborn, Mom. Dad wouldn't have wanted you to do this." Margaret felt as if she'd been slapped. "Don't use your father against me. He always supported me in everything. He supported you in sensible things, not in harebrained schemes. Get out of here, Richard. Mom, get out. Now." Richard looked at her with a mix of anger and concern, but he finally left. Margaret heard him start the car and drive off, kicking up dust on the road. She sat on the porch steps and cried. They weren't tears of sadness, but of frustration. How could her own son not understand the importance of what she was trying to do? The 2 dogs appeared and lay down beside her, as they always did. Margaret petted their heads, finding comfort in the animals' silent presence. "At least you understand," she murmured. She spent the night alone in the house for the first time. She took a sleeping bag and stayed in the living room, listening to the sounds of the property. The wind in the trees, the crickets, the rustling of small animals in the surrounding woods. She didn't feel afraid. She felt peace. The next morning, she began working on a document detailing the project. She needed something concrete to show people, something that proved it wasn't just a vague dream. Grace showed up with a friend, a retired teacher named Dorothy. The 2 offered help with the educational planning of the center. "I worked for 40 years in special education," said Dorothy, a black woman with graying hair and a warm smile. "When Grace told me about your project, I knew I had to be part of it." "I don't have money to pay," warned Margaret. "I don't want money. I want to make a difference." They sat at the kitchen table, which Margaret had cleaned and polished, and began to plan. Dorothy had experience, knowledge, ideas. Grace knew the community, knew who could help, who had resources. "We have to start small," advised Dorothy. "Maybe just 1 or 2 days a week at first. Workshops for the children, support groups for the parents." "And we need donations," added Grace. "Materials, furniture, food for snacks." "I'll speak at Sunday Mass," promised Dorothy. "Father Michael will give me space. And I'll be very direct about what happened here. People need to face the truth." Sunday came, and the church was full, as always. Margaret sat in one of the back pews, nervous. After communion, the priest called Dorothy to speak. The teacher climbed the pulpit with firm steps. She looked at the congregation and began. "Good morning, everyone. Today I'm going to talk about something this village preferred to forget. About 3 girls who were imprisoned and forgotten. About our collective guilt." A murmur went through the church. Some people looked uncomfortable, others curious. Dorothy told the whole story. She spared no details, didn't soften the truth. She talked about Robert Thompson and his shame, about Martha and her suffering, about Helen and her lonely struggle, and about Rose, Lydia, and Beatrice, 3 stolen lives. When she finished, the silence in the church was absolute. "Now we have a chance to do things differently," Dorothy continued. "Margaret Wilson, who inherited that property, wants to turn it into a support center for special needs children and their families. She's asking for our help, Not money necessarily, but time, materials, support, and above all, acknowledgement of what was done. Who here is willing to help? Raise your hand. Margaret held her breath. For a long moment, no one moved. Then timidly, Grace raised her hand. Then Walter, Betty, a few more people. And then, to Margaret's surprise, most of the congregation had raised their hands. Tears streamed down Margaret's face. She wasn't alone. The village was ready to take responsibility. After Mass, dozens of people approached her. They offered old but usable furniture, leftover building materials, hours of volunteer work. A carpenter offered to fix the windows for free. A seamstress said she could make curtains and tablecloths. The mayor, who was present at the Mass, approached with a serious expression. "I can't promise official resources," he said, "but I'll see what I can do unofficially, and I'll facilitate any documentation processes you need." Margaret thanked him, moved. The transformation of the house truly began that day. Groups of volunteers showed up every day to help. They painted walls, fixed the roof, sanded the wooden floor. What was dark and abandoned began to come to life again. Margaret made sure to preserve the room with the drawings. She only carefully cleaned the walls without erasing anything. That would be the memory room, where the story of the three sisters would be told forever. 1 month after the renovations began, Margaret returned to visit Beatrice. She brought photographs of the progress, showed the drawings and plans. Beatrice looked at everything with tears in her eyes. "You're really doing it," she murmured. "You're giving that place a new meaning." "I am, but I need you." "Me? What can an old useless woman in a wheelchair do?" "You're not useless. And I need you to come to the opening. I need people to see you, to hear you. For them to know you're not a ghost from the past, but a real living person. I don't know if I can face that place again. It will be different now, I promise." Beatrice hesitated, but ended up agreeing. "I'll go, but I want to bring something." "What?" "The dolls you brought me. I want them to go back home." Back in Pine Ridge, Margaret intensified the preparations. The opening was scheduled for 2 months from then. Dorothy created a program for the center's activities. Grace mobilized mothers and fathers of special needs children from the entire region. It was during these preparations that Margaret received an unexpected call. It was her daughter, Julie. "Mom, Richard told me what you're doing. And have you also come to tell me I'm crazy?" "No, I've come to say I want to help." Margaret nearly dropped the phone. "What?" "I work in communications, Mom. I can help promote the project, get bigger donations, attract attention. Richard is wrong. What you're doing is beautiful." "Julie, I'll come there this weekend and I'll bring the boys. They need to see this." When Julie arrived, she brought not only her teenage sons, but also a journalist friend. The woman interviewed Margaret, photographed the house, spoke with the residents. A week later, an article came out in a newspaper from the state capital about the project. And then, donations started to arrive. Money, materials, offers of professional support. A psychologist specialized in special needs children offered her services voluntarily once a week. A physical therapist said he could do the same. Companies from the region donated computers, books, educational toys. The center was becoming a reality faster than Margaret had ever imagined. But not everything was rosy. There was resistance too. Some people in the village still thought that meddling with the past was unnecessary. Others said that special needs children should be cared for in proper institutions, not in community centers. There was even an attempt to sabotage the work. One night, someone threw red paint on the newly painted walls of the house. They left a note, "Leave the past alone." Margaret was devastated when she saw it in the morning. Walter, who had started sleeping in a makeshift house on the property for security, was furious. "I'll find out who did it," he promised. "It doesn't matter who did it," said Margaret. "What matters is that we're not giving up." They cleaned the paint, painted again, and this time they installed security lights around the property. Father Michael gave a powerful sermon about forgiveness and change, but also about responsibility. He made it clear that acts of vandalism would not be tolerated. There were no more incidents. 2 weeks before the opening, Margaret received a letter. It was from St. Sebastian Valley, written with shaky but legible handwriting. "Dear Margaret, I thought a lot about going to the opening. The truth is, I'm afraid. afraid to see that house again, to relive everything I went through there. But I also have hope. Hope that you're right, that the place can be different now. I have something to tell you, something I never told anyone, not even Helen. When we were girls, and we still had some freedom to move around the house, Rose found an empty space between the floorboards and the ground in her room. We hid things there, letters, drawings, little treasures we found. It was our secret, our hidden treasure. If you can access that space, it's in the corner room, the one that faces the backyard, under the loose floorboard near the window. You'll find our memories, the things we kept just for us. I think now is the time for them to be known. With affection, Beatrice Margaret ran to the house, letter in hand. She went up to the indicated room, which was now painted light yellow and would be used for art workshops, and began searching for the loose floorboard. She found it near the window, exactly where Beatrice said. Walter helped her carefully lift the floorboard. Underneath, in a dark and dusty space, there was a rusty metal box. Margaret carefully took it out and brought it to the living room, where there was more light. She slowly opened the box. Inside, she found a real treasure trove of memories. There were letters the sisters wrote to each other, even though they lived in the same house. Small gifts they made for each other, dried flowers, colored stones, bird feathers. Drawings by Rose showing dreams and desires, a braid of hair from each of them tied together, and at the bottom of the box, a small notebook. Margaret opened it with trembling hands and began to read. It was a kind of game the sisters had created. They would write questions and take turns answering. If you could go anywhere in the world, where would it be? Rose had drawn a beach with the sun shining. Lydia wrote, "I want to meet other people like me, who don't hear." Beatrice answered, "I want to go to a real school." If you could have any job, what would it be? Rose drew someone painting a large picture. Lydia wrote, "Teacher for special children." Beatrice, "Cook in a nice restaurant." If you could change one thing in the world, what would it be? Rose drew different people holding hands. Lydia, that no one would be ashamed of being different. Beatrice, that parents would love their children just the way they are. Margaret cried, reading each page. They were such simple, such achievable dreams. And yet, denied to them for so long, she decided that notebook would be displayed in the memory room, along with the drawings on the walls. People needed to see those dreams, understand those lives. The opening week arrived. The house was unrecognizable. The once dark walls were now painted in light, cheerful colors. The windows had new curtains. The rooms were equipped with tables, chairs, educational materials. The vegetable garden had been revitalized and would be used for occupational therapy. On the eve of the opening, Julie arrived with a surprise. "Mum, I brought someone you need to meet." It was a woman about 55 years old, blonde with striking blue eyes. "My name is Sophie Carter. I'm a sign language interpreter and have worked with the deaf community for over 30 years. "Nice to meet you," greeted Margaret, not understanding where this was going. "Julie told me about your project and about the 3 sisters. One of them was deaf, right?" "Yes, Lydia." "Well, I spent the last few days researching, and I discovered something I think will interest you." Sophie opened a folder she was carrying. "About 15 years ago, I started working at a school for the deaf in Miami Beach, Florida. There I met a teaching assistant, an elderly woman named Lydia Thompson. She never spoke much about the past, but she said she had grown up isolated and only really learned sign language as an adult." Margaret's heart raced. "Lydia is alive." "She was until last year. Unfortunately, she passed away from natural causes, but she left something, an archive of her story, which she wanted shared when the right time came." Sophie took a thick envelope from the folder. "She gave this to me 5 years ago, shortly before she retired. She said that if anyone ever asked about the Thompson sisters, I should deliver it. When Julie told me about you and Beatrice, I knew it was the time." Margaret Wilson picked up the envelope with trembling hands. Inside were photographs, letters, and a written testimony. The photographs showed Lydia at different stages of her life: young, learning sign language; older, teaching children; smiling, alive, happy. The testimony began like this: "My name is Lydia Thompson, and for the first 25 years of my life, I was a prisoner of others' shame. This is my story, and the story of my sisters, Rose and Beatrice. Margaret read everything that night. Lydia told about her childhood, about the isolation, about the communication they created among themselves, but also about what came after, about how Helen took her far away to a place where she could learn, about the years of therapy, education, self-discovery, about how she became a teacher, helping other deaf children not go through what she went through, about how she found love, got married, had a daughter, about how she lived a full life despite everything. I don't want my story to be only about suffering. It was also about overcoming, about finding my voice through silence, about turning pain into purpose. If anyone ever reads this, I hope they understand. We were not helpless victims. We were survivors, we were warriors, and we deserved to be seen that way. On the morning of the inauguration, Margaret woke up before sunrise. She dressed carefully, choosing a simple but pretty dress that Julie had given her. She went to the house and walked through every room, remembering how it was when she first arrived. Gloomy, abandoned, scary. And now it was full of light, color, hope. At 9 in the morning, the guests began to arrive. Families from the area, local authorities, journalists, volunteers, village residents. Walter was at the entrance in new clothes, greeting everyone with a smile Margaret had never seen before. Grace and Dorothy were arranging chairs in the backyard where the ceremony would take place. Betty was preparing coffee and cakes in the kitchen. Julie coordinated everything with impressive efficiency. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, feel free to leave a like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now continuing. At 10 o'clock, an adapted van arrived. Margaret felt her heart race. It was Beatrice. The nurses helped lower the wheelchair. Beatrice looked at the house and her hands trembled. Margaret quickly approached. "Are you ready?" "I think so," Beatrice answered in a weak voice. "You don't have to go in if you don't want to." "I want to. I need to." They pushed the wheelchair to the porch. Beatrice touched the wood of the door, her eyes filled with tears. "It looks different." "It is different. Come see." They entered together. Beatrice looked around the living room, now bright and welcoming. They visited every room. When they reached the memory room, Beatrice asked to be alone for a few minutes. Margaret waited outside. She could hear Beatrice crying inside. They were heavy tears from years of stored pain, but also of relief, of liberation. When Beatrice came out, her eyes were red, but there was peace on her face. "Thank you," was all she said. The ceremony began at noon. Father Michael said a prayer. The mayor spoke about community responsibility. Dorothy explained how the center would operate, and then it was Beatrice's turn. Margaret pushed the wheelchair to the front of everyone. The entire village was there, looking at that elderly lady many had ignored decades ago. Beatrice began to speak in a low but firm voice. "My name is Beatrice Thompson. I am 87 years old, and for 25 years of my life, I lived as a prisoner in this house." An absolute silence fell over the crowd. "I wasn't a prisoner because of bars or chains. I was a prisoner of the shame my father felt for me and my sisters. Shame that we were born different." Beatrice told her story. She spared no details. She spoke about the isolation, about the fear, about the dreams they kept to themselves. She spoke about Helen and her solitary courage, about Rose, who passed away in peace, about Lydia, who built a beautiful life despite everything. But I also want to say this. Don't just hold on to the pain of our story. Remember our strength too. We created our own language. We maintained our humanity in inhumane situations. We loved each other fiercely, and we survived. She looked at the house behind her. This place, which was our prison, will now be liberation for other children. It will be the place where they learn that being different is not a reason for shame, it's a reason for celebration. When she finished, many people were crying. Some approached her, asking for forgiveness. Beatrice accepted with grace but made it clear, forgiveness doesn't erase the past, but it can build a better future. After the ceremony, they took a tour of the center. They showed the classrooms, the therapy spaces, the vegetable garden, the memory room. The families who came with their special needs, children looked at everything with hope in their eyes. A young mother, holding the hand of a boy with Down syndrome, approached Margaret. "Thank you," she said, with tears streaming down. "Thank you for doing this. My son will have what those girls didn't have, a place to learn, to grow, to be happy." Margaret hugged the woman, feeling that all the effort had been worth it. The party continued until dusk. There was music, food, laughter. The children ran around the backyard, the same backyard where Rose, Lydia, and Beatrice had been confined. But now it was different. It was life. It was joy. It was freedom. When the sun began to set, Margaret found Beatrice alone on the porch watching everything. "What are you thinking about?" asked Margaret, sitting beside her. "I'm thinking that Rose and Lydia would be happy, that we finally managed to turn our pain into something beautiful. Will you come back and I will? If they let me, I want to be a counselor at the center. I want to help other families avoid the mistakes mine made. It will be an honor to have you." Beatrice took Margaret's hand. "You could have sold this property and pocketed the money. You could have ignored our story. Why didn't you?" Margaret thought for a moment. "Because I also know what it's like to be invisible. I know what it's like to be discarded by society just because I aged or became a widow. And when I learned your story, I saw a chance to do something that mattered, to give a voice to those who were silenced. You are an incredible woman. No, I'm just someone who refused to accept that things can't change." That night, after everyone had left, Margaret stayed alone in the house. She walked through the rooms, touching the walls, feeling the transformation. It was no longer a place of fear. It was a place of hope. The following days were busy. The center really started operating. Children came from all over the region, some with physical disabilities, others with intellectual ones, others just with learning difficulties. All were welcomed with love and without judgment. Dorothy coordinated the educational activities masterfully. Grace took care of the administrative part. Walter kept the property in order. Betty organized the snacks and sometimes stayed to tell stories to the children. Volunteers came and went. Some were regulars, others showed up when they could. But everyone contributed in some way. Beatrice came twice a week, brought by the nursing home van. She sat in her wheelchair in the memory room and talked with the families, sharing her story, offering advice, and most importantly, reminding everyone where that place had come from and why it existed. 3 months after the inauguration, Margaret received an unexpected visit. It was Richard, her son. He arrived on a Saturday morning when the center was in full swing. He stood at the entrance watching the children playing in the backyard, the parents talking on the porch, the therapists working in the rooms. Margaret saw him and walked over to him. "Hi, Richard." "Hi, Mom." They were silent for a moment. "Julie showed me the article in the newspaper," he finally said, "and the photos, and she told me about Beatrice. And I was wrong. Completely wrong." Margaret felt her eyes well up. "I came to apologize and to offer help. I know some doctors who do volunteer work. I can bring them here if you want." "I do. Very much." Richard looked around again. "You turned a place of horror into a place of healing. How did you manage it? It wasn't just me. It was a whole community deciding to do things differently. I'm proud of you, Mom. Dad would be too." Margaret hugged her son, feeling the relief of having his support at last. Richard spent the day at the center, getting to know the people, understanding how it worked. Before leaving, he promised to bring his wife and children the following week. "The boys need to see this," he said. "They need to learn these lessons." The center continued to grow. 6 months after its opening, they were already serving more than 50 children regularly. The families became a community, supporting each other, sharing experiences. One day, a psychologist who worked as a volunteer pulled Margaret aside. "Have you noticed the impact you're having? Not just on the children, but on the parents too." "How so?" "Many of these parents were carrying shame, guilt, fear. They thought they had failed their children. Here they're learning that having a special child isn't a failure. It's just different." Margaret smiled. "That's exactly what I wanted." The months passed. The centre became a reference in the region. Other towns began asking how to replicate the model. Margaret and Dorothy started doing consulting, helping other communities create their own spaces. It was during one of these consultations, in a neighbouring town, that Margaret met a woman about 60 years old named Teresa. "I heard about your centre," said Teresa, "and about the story of the Thompson sisters. I need to tell you something." They sat in a local cafe. Teresa began her story. 40 years ago, when I was 20, I worked as a nurse in a small hospital in the countryside. A woman was admitted there very ill, Martha Thompson." Margaret's heart raced. "The girl's mother?" "Yes. She was dying and knew it. One night she called me and made me promise something." "What?" "That I would tell the truth about her, that she hadn't been a willing accomplice in her daughter's isolation, that she had tried to run away with them several times, that Robert threatened her, hurt her, controlled her completely. She was a victim too." "Exactly. But she carried so much guilt. Oh, she thought she had failed her daughters. I promised her that one day, when it was safe, I would tell the truth. Why didn't you tell it before?" "Fear. Robert had a powerful family. Even after he died, I was afraid. But now, seeing what you're doing, I feel it's time." Margaret took Teresa to meet Beatrice. The two talked for hours. Teresa told everything Martha had said in those last days. Beatrice cried, but they were tears of relief. "I always knew Mom loved us," said Beatrice, "but there was a part of me that was angry with her for not protecting us. Now I understand that she was a prisoner too." Martha's story was added to the memory room, not to excuse her completely, but to show the complexity of the situation, to remind that in stories of abuse there are often victims on all sides. 1 year after the opening, they held a big celebration. Hundreds of people came, families who had been helped, volunteers, community members. Beatrice was there, physically more fragile but strong in spirit. She delivered a moving speech about transformation and hope. "A year ago, I returned to this place with fear and pain. Today, I return with joy. This center isn't just about special children. It's about humanity. It's about choosing to see the best in people, to give chances, to build bridges instead of walls." The celebration was beautiful. There were performances by the children, an exhibition of the artwork they created, music and dance. Margaret looked at everything with a full heart. She thought of Helen, who had started it all with her solitary courage. She thought of Rose, Lydia, and Beatrice, who had survived the impossible. She thought of the village which chose to confront its shame and do things differently. At night, when everyone had left, Margaret sat on the porch with the 2 dogs at her feet. Walter appeared with 2 cups of coffee. "Want some company?" "Always." They sat in silence for a moment, just enjoying the peace of the night. "You know, when I first came here, I thought I was just fulfilling an obligation," said Margaret, "settling an inheritance, maybe selling the property. And now? Now I know it was much more than that. It was finding a purpose. It was remembering that even at 62 I can still make a difference." "You did more than make a difference. You changed lives." "No, we changed lives, all of us together." Walter smiled. "That's true. Alone we are weak. Together we are strong." More months passed. The centre continued to thrive. New partnerships were formed. New volunteers came forward. More families were helped. Margaret moved permanently to Pine Ridge. She renovated a small house near the centre and made it her home. Julie and her grandchildren visited regularly. Richard brought his family once a month and coordinated free medical care for the children. Beatrice began living in an adapted room at the centre itself. She no longer wanted to be away from the place that now represented everything she and her sisters had dreamed of. 2 years after the opening, on Beatrice's birthday, they held a special celebration. It was then that Margaret revealed her surprise. "Beatrice, you and your sisters kept dreams in a box under the floorboards. Today, we want to show that those dreams have come true." Margaret brought out 3 large panels, each dedicated to a sister. The first showed Rose. There were reproductions of her drawings, photos of her in her later years, happy and cared for, and a picture of children at the center, painting and drawing freely. Rose dreamed of being an artist. Today, children here create art without fear. The second panel was for Lydia, photos of her teaching, smiling, living, and images of Sophie, the interpreter, teaching sign language to the children at the center. Lydia dreamed of being a teacher. Today, her legacy lives on in every child who learns to communicate. The third was for Beatrice, photos of her over the years and images of her in the center's kitchen, helping Betty prepare meals when her health allowed. Beatrice dreamed of cooking in a beautiful place. Today, her kitchen nourishes bodies and souls. Beatrice cried so much that Margaret grew worried, but they were good tears, of healing, of closure. "My sisters, they would be so happy," sobbed Beatrice. "They are happy," Margaret said with certainty. "Wherever they are, they know you've won." That night, Beatrice asked to be alone in the memory room. Margaret respected her wish, but stayed nearby in case she was needed. Hours later, when she went to check, she found Beatrice sleeping peacefully in the chair, with a smile on her face. In her arms, she held the 3 dolls they had made as children, reunited once more. The years continued to pass. The center expanded, gained new rooms, new programs. It became a model for other initiatives across Colorado. Margaret grew older but never stopped. At 67, she was still active, still fighting, still believing. Beatrice also continued, surprising everyone with her resilience. At 92 years old, she still came to the center, still spoke with families, still shared her story. It was on a spring afternoon, 5 years after the center's opening, that Beatrice asked to speak with Margaret in private. "I need to tell you something," she said, her voice weaker than before but still clear. "What is it?" "My days are numbered. I feel it in my body. And that's okay. I've lived much longer than I ever imagined, and I've lived with dignity. But before I go, I need you to promise me something. Anything. Promise me you'll continue, that you won't let this place die, that you'll keep the memory of Rose, Lydia, and me alive, not as victims, but as survivors, as victors." "I promise, with all my heart." Beatrice smiled. "I also want you to know that you gave me the greatest gift anyone could give. You gave me back my humanity. You showed that our story had value, that we had value. You always did. But we needed someone to remind us of that. Thank you, Margaret, for everything." They embraced 2 elderly women who had become soul sisters through shared struggle. Beatrice passed away 3 months later, sleeping peacefully in her room at the center. She was 92 years old and departed in peace, surrounded by people who loved her. The funeral was immense. Hundreds of people came to pay their respects. Families she had helped, children she had inspired, community members she had challenged to do better. Margaret spoke at the funeral, tears streaming down her face. Beatrice spent most of her life being invisible, being forgotten. But her final years were exactly the opposite. She was seen, she was heard, she was loved. And through her, Rose and Lydia were also honored. They buried Beatrice next to Rose in the small-town cemetery where Rose had lived her final years. On the tombstone they engraved, "Beatrice Thompson, 1933-2025, survivor, warrior, free, together with her sisters, finally at peace." Margaret continued the work at the center. Beatrice was right. Her days were also numbered. Everyone's are. But she was determined to make each one count. The center grew even more. It gained national recognition. Other states began to replicate the model. The story of the 3 sisters became a symbol of the fight for inclusion and dignity. Margaret, now 68 years old, began writing a book telling everything. The story of the sisters, the transformation of the house, the building of the center. She wanted it recorded, never to be forgotten. Julie helped publish the book. It became a bestseller, touching hearts across the country. The royalties were directed back to the center, ensuring its sustainability. One afternoon, 6 years after receiving those rusty keys from the lawyer, Margaret sat on the same porch where she had first sat. So many changes since then. So much suffering transformed into hope. Grace appeared with hot tea. "What are you thinking about?" "About how a place can change. About how people can change. You changed this place, and you changed many people. It wasn't me. It was the courage of 3 girls who refused to be forgotten. I just heard their call." Betty joined them, then Walter, then Dorothy. They all sat together on the porch, sharing stories, laughing, remembering. "You know what I find most amazing," said Dorothy. "It's that this village, which was so ashamed to face its past, is now a national example of how to do things differently, how to turn mistakes into lessons." "People are capable of change," Margaret replied. "They just need the courage to start." As the sun set over Pine Ridge, Margaret looked at the house that had frightened her so much at first. Now it was a beacon of hope. The dolls were no longer hanging on the fence as symbols of isolation. They were inside, being used in therapies, telling stories, teaching empathy. The drawings on the walls of the memory room were still there, protected and preserved. But now, around them, there were new drawings, of happy children, of united families, of dreams come true. The vegetable garden that Rose, Lydia, and Beatrice cultivated in secret now fed dozens of children. The spaces where they had been confined were now places of freedom and discovery. The transformation was complete. Not because the past was erased, but because it was faced, honored, and overcome. That night, Margaret wrote the last page of her book. This is not just the story of 3 girls who suffered. It is the story of 3 warriors who won. It is the story of a community that had the courage to look at its biggest mistake and do things differently. It is the story of how a place of shadows can become a place of light. Rose, Lydia, and Beatrice were not forgotten. Their names now echo in every child who laughs in the backyard of that house. Their legacy lives on in every family that finds support instead of judgment. Their victory is in every story of inclusion and dignity that continues to be written. And for me, a 62-year-old widow who received an unexpected inheritance, it was the journey that showed me it's never too late to make a difference. That purpose has no age. That a willing heart can move mountains. The dolls are no longer on the fence. They are in the arms of children who know that being different is being special. The house no longer scares anyone. It welcomes with open arms all who need it. And the fear everyone had, it turned into pride. Pride in having done the right thing, even if belatedly. Pride in having created something beautiful from the ashes of the past. This is our story, and it continues to be written every day. End of story. Now tell us what you thought of this story. Did Margaret make the right decision in turning that scary house into a center of hope? Would you have the same courage she had? Leave your opinion in the comments and tell us where you're watching from. Your participation is very important to us. Don't forget to leave your like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss other touching stories that will move your heart.